Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Asian Downstream Summit digital event. We're absolutely delighted to have you all here with us today. In today's session, we'll be taking a look at the energy transition, as well as pertinent topics, including Scope 1 to Scope 3 emissions, long-term strategies for a sustainable, low-carbon future, the financial viability of the energy transition, as well as how this transition shifts from a regional to global perspective. We'll be examining these themes today with a panel discussion led by Sushant Gupta, Director Wood Mackenzie, who will be moderator of today's session. I'd like to invite Sushant to turn on your camera and microphone, please. Hello, Sushant. Good to see you.
Hi, Natalie. How are you?
All right, thank you. So for our attendees who are attending today's digital event, during this session, you may feel free to ask questions by typing into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. There'll be a live Q&A session after the initial discussion, so feel free to ask away. Without further ado, I'll hand the time over to Sushant to introduce our panelists and start the session proper. Over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here, and thanks to Asia Downstream team for having me here. I will be moderating a discussion on a very interesting and relevant topic, which will look at reconfigurations of the refining and the chemical industry for the journey through the energy transition. And we'll discuss a number of interesting aspects, through our industry experts, joining us today. We have with us online already Suhas Japtiwale. He is working as an Assistant Vice President Strategic Planning with Reliance Industries Limited. He has 23 years of experience, including working in refining and petrochemicals in different fields like operations, technical services, R&D, planning and scheduling, and business development. His team is currently working on a very important step for Reliance on oil to chemicals, with the focus on increasing the petrochemical intensity of the refinery. We also have with us online Sunil Patil. Sunil is a Senior Director of Solution Consulting with Aspen Tech Asia. He has a master's in chemical engineering from India. Sunil has over 22 years of rich experience in process industry, leading diverse team. He is currently responsible for solution consulting and market development of Aspen Tech performance engineering products and solutions for Asia Pacific. He leads the Aspen Tech solution consulting team for Asia Pac Japan region, and his key focus is to help clients achieve their sustainability goals and enabling a digital transformation. Now we welcome you both to this discussion. Now I think to start with, we'll just give some reference to the last 2 years, which are truly unprecedented for the global refining industry. The industry has enjoyed record margins for the past 2 years, and now in the last few months we have seen industry getting back to normal margins. So the key question is this a more normal trend for the refining industry? But that is not the focus of discussion today. That is for some other day. We would like this talk to focus on the storm which is awaiting the refining industry, and our discussion will be around the impact of energy transition and solutions for refining and chemical producers and the pathways for sustainable development in the future. Right, so we'll get into the real action now. The first, discussion topic, which, we have received a lot of feedback from our clients, and also for a number of people online in this forum, is what are the current future solutions for the refining and chemical industry if they have to decarbonize? Right, they must find ways to reduce carbon emissions, and no one size fits all. So I would like to first invite thoughts from Suhas in terms of what are the current decarbonization options which you have considered within your network, within your discussions.
Okay, good morning, Sushant. Decarbonization I can start with the scope of the emission. So there are three types: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions, and we have to reduce each of them. So for scope 1, they are direct emissions which are from the process itself, and scope 2 emissions are indirect from the utilities. So targeting scope 2 will be the first near-term goal. The scope 2 emissions can be reduced by increasing the energy efficiency. That will also help in reducing the costs of refining and other processes. So that should be the first step. Then scope 2 emissions, scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions. So those are the intrinsic emissions. So reducing them will require capturing the carbon and sequestering. So carbon capture and CCUS, both of these need a lot of development. And for carbon capture, R&D development is also required, so that there are technologies which can efficiently and completely capture the carbon, which can be used for some other purpose. And CCUS is already under development. There are some avenues which are there and some which are still being developed. And the scope 3 emissions for a refinery are very large emissions. Those are associated with the product. So as long as the refinery is producing and supplying fuels, the scope 3 emissions would be a major part of the emissions. So for scope 3, there are again, one is to reduce fuel, means for that there has to be a lot of development in the vehicles also, and in other like electric vehicles and other things. But the other thing is you can have some other avenues where you are reducing the carbon, and you can set off the carbon emissions in the fuels. So those are the three short term, medium term, short term and long term goals. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think you rightly categorized in terms of when you think about decarbonization, you'll have to first think about where those emissions are being emitted and what's the scope of them. Because many companies, many countries are defining the boundaries between these emissions and what are within their remit to reduce them. Now, Sunil, from your perspective, what have you been discussing in terms of the solutions for within your network?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good morning, all, and thanks, thanks everyone here. Thanks, Sushant and Suhas. So, as Suhas already elaborated, right, the different measures to achieve the net zero and decarbonization for scope 1, 2, and 3 are different, right? He talked about from an owner's perspective. So, from an Aspentech perspective, I think, as you all know, we are solution providers to help address our customers the sustainability challenges, right? So when it comes to decarbonization, what we have done, we have actually developed what we call as the sustainability pathways, right? So how do we address immediate challenges and future? I mean, today, tomorrow, and maybe day after, right? If I may put into three buckets, right? So what is this sustainability pathways, right? As I think was rightly said, right? One is to scope one for look at the opportunities to reduce the carbonate process itself, and then energy, and then and going into the further details and scope 3 and so on, right? So from an Aspentech solutions perspective, we are trying to address the different challenges, right, at be it energy efficiency, emission management, waste reduction, water conservation, electrification, and so on, right? So while we do that, we help address the challenges by using our solutions. How do we optimize that? How do we come up with the technology which help address these sustainability challenges, right? And our solutions are being already adopted in energy industry, in oil and gas industry, for scope 1 and scope 2 sustainability challenges, to address those challenges, right? So as part of this what we call the pathways, right? So we do have a sustainability models which help address evaluating different bio feedstocks, renewable energy, what are the alternate sources, CCS and CCUS, right? How do you capture the carbon? How do you store it? what are the different alternatives to carbon, capture the carbon, right? And then most important, looking at the hydrogen, right? We all talk about green hydrogen, but is it a viable? How do we bring down the capex of the hydrogen production, overall investment, right? And then at next level, we also look at the circular economy, right, which is recycling the plastics and then using CO2 as a feedstock, right? So all those options are available, right? But then companies are confused, right? And then where do they start? Where do they get? Because everyone has a goal, but then it requires an investment. It is a lot of potential is there. But then we have to trade off somewhere like in investment versus the right. How do we achieve the targets and so on, right? So from a solution perspective, AspenTech offers the process optimization, process modeling, as well as capex optimization solutions in help to address all these sustainability challenges, right? And our solutions are being used for all the scope 1, scope 2, and of course scope 3 is a bit complex, but then it still is able to address that.
Thank you, Sunil. Now I think. So I think what I'm hearing is, well, obviously there's no shortage of solutions
Yes.
at present. We are, starting with a more traditional approach of focusing on energy efficiency, whether you look at your efficiency improvement for furnaces, your boilers, your pumps, etc. Right? I mean, from an over energy savings perspective, that's the first thing, and I think refiners have already been, doing a great job in that area in terms of energy savings and optimization, because refining margins have always been thin compared to the upstream industry. So the energy efficiency part of the refiners has always been a goal for them, and that probably will get them to say 10 to 15% of the overall reduction in decarbonization or carbon emissions, right? But for a deeper decarbonization, some of the technologies which Suhas mentioned was around CCUS. Sunil, you mentioned green hydrogen, and I think we should also add to the overall kit is around when you talk about the scope 3 emissions, increasing the production of renewable fuels, such as HVO, SAF, by processing, more and more of vegetable oil, which I think many refiners are slowly gearing towards. So essentially producing, those products which have lower emissions, in the overall kit, that's probably will attack your scope 3 emissions. The other point which I would add is also on the feedstock perspective, looking at low carbon crude. There are aspects, for example, if you process crude A, which is from an upstream perspective has higher emissions, it will result into higher emissions in the refinery. So many refiners should also look at choosing the right kind of crude in in that environment, right? So that's another aspect of reducing your emissions.
Sure.
And I think Sunil, you mentioned some great points around some of the barriers. Obviously, there are many solutions. They have a goal in mind, but how do you reach from point A to point B? And I think you touch base on some of the cost perspective. And I think from your perspective, so in terms of, I mean, do you have any examples of how do
Yes.
you make these investments work for the actual producers who wants to achieve these goals?
Exactly. I think it's a good question, and it's been discussed quite a lot, right? So coming back to my point, right? How do we optimize this entire, we call it entire value chain, right? Be it for CCUS, for emission, for hydrogen or bio feedstock and so on. So what is this entire value chain, right? It's an end to end, right? From research and development all the way up to the end use, right? And if I to take an example right here, let's say from either green hydrogen or CCS, right? So hydrogen, right? And it is itself is a challenge in this terms of storage, in terms of safety, right? And what we need that, right? We expect hydrogen cars and so on, but do we have fuel cells ready? Do have electrolyzers available, right, to make green hydrogen and so on? So what we have to address these challenges is an entire value chain, right, from research and development, then reliability of the hydrogen system, then how do we scale up, because most plants are at a pilot level, then how to scale up into the production level, then optimize the renewable power integration, right? Because when it greens, then everything has to be the renewable source and so on. And then most important challenge is about the storage and safety and transportation, right? So in our value chain, we do provide a solution, we do provide a software services to help address this entire value chain, right from a research and development, where we do find out how do we build electrolyzer itself, right? Because that's something someone has to start, right? And because today a lot is being talked about electrolyzer, but then is that electrolyzer available, what's capacity, technologies, and so on, because most companies still doing a lot of research, right? And then scale up, because if you look at the plants, right, available today, I think they are at a pilot scale. Then the question really is about how do you scale it up, right? And what are the locations to have these kind of plants? Because it again try dependent on the renewable sources and so on, right? And then look at the de-risking, right? Reliability, right? Where you have to look at the investments versus return kind of thing. What's the cost of cost of the production, right? Because today if you look at that, like $5 a kg, maybe it's not affordable in countries, right? So then how can I bring down to the dollar a kg, or kind of less than dollar, right? So those are the different aspects we look into it when we do say that end to end, right? From the research, innovation research, all the way up to the end use, right? And I must say we do have a lot of examples, references from Asia, including India, where our customers from refining petrochemical, as well as the companies who are coming into the green hydrogen space, right? Using our solutions to completely build the entire value chain optimization, right? So in other words, basically, we do have a process modeling solution which help to design and optimize the plant configuration. Then we do have a reliability modeling solution which does the risk analysis, reliability modeling, Monte Carlo analysis, right? Where you look at the investment versus the spares required, the parts required, the technologies, the licensors, and things like that. And from there, we do use solutions for the advanced process control, the data historian, data mining. We also bring in AI/ML, which is artificial intelligence and machine learning, into the solution to help further optimize those solutions using data and in combination with first principle models, right? And then finally, storage safety and the end use, right? So this is again an important aspect, right? So how do you store it? What are the safety aspects of that, right? Is there enough facilities available, right? And then in maybe an end use case, probably an example of fuel cell, right? So are there enough technologies available for that? Who are the companies investing into that, right? So we look at into the entire value chain optimization, and we try to address the barriers, right, in each of this entire value chain, right from research all the way up to the end use. And every stage there are barriers, but then technology solutions can help to address those.
Yeah, I think very rightly said. I think obviously the cost of green hydrogen will be one of the
Yes.
key, uh, I would say, barriers for the penetration of green hydrogen. So at the moment, it is much more expensive. Now, I think obviously with the high gas prices, last year, we could see green hydrogen becoming more competitive. But again, now the gas prices are much lower. Gray hydrogen is back in competition. But I think in my perspective, I think also one of the key barrier for penetration of green hydrogen is also around the infrastructure. I mean, the green hydrogen should be competitive at the point of delivery, right? Projects around transportation of liquid hydrogen, whether in form of liquid hydrogen or ammonia or methanol, storage and reconversion, projects, they have to go hand in hand with the green hydrogen production at large sites, right? So how do you connect the producing sites and the consumers, right? And that's a link on the midstream, or the linkage on transportation of green hydrogen from the production sites to the consuming site, because they both are at different locations, and they will be at different locations.
Yeah.
So I think that will be one of the key areas to look at when we talk about green hydrogen. Now I think in the well obviously other area which I think which we haven't spoken about is the petchem integration, right? We speak to a number of clients, and they, as a step towards decarbonization, now they want to move towards petchem integration for two reasons, right? One is, environmental sustainability is key, but before that, they will also have to be profitable, right? If you're not a profitable company, there's no point looking at decarbonization aspect, right? Because you spend billions of dollars on decarbonization, but at the end of the day, if your site is not competitive, you will not be able to sustain in the longer run. So I think with this, I would invite Suhas's thoughts on, and I think he leads a team in Reliance in making the move from oil to chemicals. Now, what are your thoughts around this area?
Yeah, as you rightly said, these are the two reasons. One is decarbonization, but other is also profitability. And if you see, there are some Chinese refineries coming up which have a very high petrochemical intensity. Petrochemical intensity is the percentage of crude that is going towards petrochemicals. So historically, it was around 5 to 7% of the crude used to go towards petrochemicals. Then it's increased to 10-15%. Now we have in India that's around average 10-15%, and the new Chinese refineries which are coming up, they are going up to 45, 50, or even more than 50% of the crude going towards petrochemicals. So that's the petrochemical intensity, and that is not because of decarbonization. That is because of the profitability, and that is because of the market. They have a huge petrochemicals market as compared to fuels. So the oil is going into petrochemicals. So that is one aspect. The second aspect is decarbonization also, because as you produce fuels, you will be producing, the fuels will burn and you will be producing carbon, CO2, which goes to atmosphere. Other than that, if you are producing petrochemicals, the fossil carbon which is coming out of the earth, you are fixing it into a petrochemical, which is going to be there for a long time, which is going to be used for a long. So that is another aspect. So as you said, these are the two.
Yeah. So I think when you move from, say, 5 to 10% towards more 40% chemicals, or even higher, I mean, will the site be more emission intensive as compared in terms of the scope one emissions, or sorry, in terms of the scope two emissions, where where
Scope 2 emission.
scope, right, where you are making the site scope one and two emissions will increase if the site is much more energy intensive to convert crude oil to chemicals, because you'll have to input more energy. I mean, how do you balance that out within your in your judgment in terms of move towards petrochemicals?
Right. So the targeting the scope 2 emissions, which are for the utilities. Uh, the first thing is the convert the electricity to renewable electricity. So the solar energy is currently at par, means it has reached a priority with the fossil energy. So that is the easiest and the first thing that one can do, that convert the electricity to renewable electricity. The other thing, the fuels. So wherever the fuels are being burnt, if that can be changed to hydrogen, then the carbon emissions will be low. Now, while producing this hydrogen, as you said, this is a gray hydrogen, will again emit a lot of CO2. So if that hydrogen is green hydrogen, then your carbon emissions are reducing in the process. So that is the second thing. Then uh, another thing is convert all the steam turbines to electrically operated motors. So that will again reduce the use of steam, reduce the fuel, and increase the use of renewable energy. So these are the steps which can be taken to decarbonize, means reduce the scope 2 emissions. But you are right, means once you start producing more of petrochemicals, you are going to slightly increase the scope 1 and 2 emissions and reduce the scope 3 emissions in a big way. So it's not balancing actually. The emissions are coming down, but it's getting shifted from lot of scope 3 emissions to a small amount of scope 1 and 2 emissions, which can be dealt with using current available technologies and efforts can be done in that direction.
I agree. I think that's a good. I mean, I think obviously if your company wants to reduce scope 3 emissions, if that is your part of your boundary you've defined for yourself, then moving towards petrochemicals will also help from that regard. And although you would actually increase the scope 1 and 2 emissions, as you said, you would actually overall benefit from a lower scope 3 emissions because you're not burning fuels such as gasoline, diesel, and that actually justifies that shift from fuels to chemicals, a larger portion of chemicals now. So even though even if you pay a higher in terms of carbon taxes because your scope 1 and 2 emissions go up, the overall value for petrochemicals would still be positive because you're producing petrochemicals which are hopefully higher value in the future compared to fuels, because that's where the demand is going. Right, so that was I think another thread. Now I think we also have discussed at large with a number of refiners moving away from producing large portion of gasoline and diesel to more renewable products, such as either blending ethanol into gasoline or processing used cooking oil or vegetable oil in the refineries to produce HVO, which can be blended into diesel, as a renewable diesel. It is a very hot topic at the moment, and related to that is also sustainable aviation fuel, which again is a very hot topic amongst the decarbonization options. Now, uh, uh, I would say, Suhas, from your perspective, have you looked at? I know India is still growing in terms of biofuels mandate. What are your thoughts around this area?
Yeah, India is still growing there. Means we are currently in India, the government is allowing up to 20% of ethanol blend in gasoline. So the driving force will be the availability of ethanol. So ethanol is again, it's a food versus fuel competition, because ethanol being produced in India is from mainly from sugarcane, and currently the target is the ethanol from molasses, which doesn't go into potable ethanol, that has to go into fuels. So availability of that ethanol is an issue. Now, once we start, once there are technologies which are developed for second generation and third generation ethanol production, like from the whole plant or from the biomass production of ethanol is developed, then more availability and more green ethanol will be available, and that would be even more helpful for getting into gasoline and blending. The other aspect is the engines. So engines also, current engines which are being used, the ICEs, so they are able to take only up to 20% ethanol. So if we see the case of Brazil, Brazil has flexible engines can take more ethanol also. So that is developed because they have ethanol availability and they can blend. So the engines were developed. Now, the same case can be in India as well, or in other Asian countries or other parts of the world. So it's all depends on the availability. So availability will be the driving force.
Absolutely. I think in terms of the overall availability, I think it's one, as you rightly pointed out, the food versus fuel debate in the conventional biofuels area, right? Ethanol, biodiesel. I think, and that's why the focus is more shifting towards a renewal feedstock, where we focus on waste products, right? Which actually move the debate away from food versus fuel, right? I mean, you focus on waste products such as used cooking oil, waste fats, tallow oil, which actually can be hydroprocessed, hydrotreated within the refinery using the similar equipment in the refinery to produce HVO and SAF. And that actually is gaining a lot of momentum in Europe and US, particularly because of the regulations in place, because the prices for SAF and HVO are much higher than the regular, 10 ppm diesel, for example. So if you do not have the subsidy and the bio ticket which are existing in Europe, it will be hard to justify that in Asia Pacific. Now, I think, Sunil, from your perspective, I'm not too sure. This area is something which you have looked at within your overall solution, framework. But is there a framework you have in mind to support this conversion of refineries, towards bio setup?
Absolutely. I think it's a good question again. So I think the couple of things I would say here. So one is conversion of refinery. Now traditionally, I mean, all refineries generates the fuels, right? I think what is going to be future, and most companies, right, is going to be what we call O2C, is basically oils to chemicals, right? So moving from the traditional fuels to going into the fuels, more of a chemicals, right? But then again, what are the alternatives feedstock available, right? I mean, crude is of course a source, but then how do we generate biodiesel, for example? I think Suhas mentioned, you talked about 2G or 3G ethanol options, right? And how do we blend them? What are the different options? Is government promoting that more than 5%, 10%? Because I think some countries, like Suhas mentioned, like Brazil and others, they're far ahead. But then India itself, right? We do have ethanol, but is our engines ready to take the blended fuel and so on? So from a technology perspective, what we are doing and trying to work with some large oil producers, right, is basically how to maximize the chemical production, right? So that is what we call O2C, that it means oil to chemicals direct, right? That's one way of helping that challenge. Second is looking at alternative feedstocks, right? So of course crude is there, but then what are the alternative bio feedstocks available, right? In order to help to basically get the more green sustainable solutions, right? Which includes, of course, the ethanol is one, but then the having the alternative resources, of course, it again is not something which is ready to go in the market, or technology is available, right? Or companies are there, but then because there are a lot of challenges as well, right? When you say bio, right? I mean, it is again a collection, the availability, right? Supply chain, right? A lot of things are dependent on there, right? So from our perspective, basically, we are working with large oil and gas companies or energy companies to looking at these aspects, right? So if I talk from a refinery perspective, right, historically, there are columns which actually separate or fraction your crude into the different energy products like kero diesel, and then we go to the downstream. But then we are working to having a kind of a reactor which helps to generate your crude to chemicals directly to maximize the propylene production kind of thing. And of course, further, then it will be used to the different product lines. And similarly in the bio feedstocks, right? So those are the areas from a technology perspective are working.
Sure. No, I think on this point, technology will definitely play a key part, but I think you hinted towards the supply chain aspects now, which I think is becoming one of the key hurdles for the growth in the HVO and the SAF market. I think there is a market demand in Europe and the US to blend HVO and SAF, right? So demand has been created by the regulations.
Yeah.
There is enough incentive provided by the government to make this HVO SAF economical from a blending perspective.
Yeah.
But most of the feedstock which Europe, US will use are being imported.
Yeah.
Particularly from Asia Pacific. I think that the supply chain aspect becomes a key issue.
Absolutely.
For this higher biofuel. So obviously we know that the food-based biofuels will become a hurdle, right? And Europe is moving away from the food-based biofuels because of deforestation, for example, and also competition with food. And for this, the aggregating this waste products, for example, used cooking oil from restaurants, from households, is one of the key challenges. I think there are not enough aggregators in the market to actually combine all this used cooking oil. So how do you secure this feedstock? You may put in a biorefinery in a location where the demand center is, but the key question is how do you secure the feedstock to feed the refinery? Similar to crude oil, right? I mean, so crude oil, you'll also have to look at security of supply of your feedstock. So I think that is becoming a key issue for many of the producers who wants to venture into biorefineries. And the second for Asia, I think one of the key challenges, the regulations are not in place. So if you produce HVO, which is at a much higher price, and if you don't export this to Europe, you actually blend this down into diesel 10 ppm, which is at a lower price. So you're actually losing money by blending it down to diesel 10 ppm because there are no regulations supporting or providing enough subsidies or support for this blending of HVO into 10 ppm diesel. So I think, so for Asia's perspective, we need to see a much stronger regulations from the government side to be able to support this blending operations of HVO and into diesel, for example. SAF similarly, right? I mean, regulations are lagging behind. We see, many governments are trying to put in more regulations of SAF blending, but again not to the same extent as Europe and US are doing, right? So I think from Asia's perspective, regulations will be a key. And the third aspect, which I want to now slowly move towards, is how will the carbon markets or carbon pricing help? Right? Could that be an area where government or companies will start to look at more and more towards making some of these options viable for their setup? So so as from your perspective, I mean, what are your thoughts on carbon pricing, carbon markets, right, in terms of as an enabler to some of these options we are discussing?
Yeah, carbon markets, if means they are under development, so that would help a lot, because if someone is taking steps to reduce the carbon, then that can be encashed, that can be taken to the market, and someone who needs the carbon credits, that they can buy these carbon credits and offset their carbon emissions. So once these markets are developed and they are in place, it would help in additional investments in decarbonization technologies. Like you said, currently HVO or the SAF, uh, the logistic is an issue. So collection of the material, collection of the biomass, and transportation to till the biorefinery is also a big cost. So like you said, there are no aggregators, because there is no case, there is no economic case to put in efforts in this direction. So once the markets are developed, maybe this will also be easy and this will also be profitable. So for having these kind of carbon markets would be a good thing, and I think it's proceeding slowly in that direction.
Yeah, I agree. I think, I mean, slow, but definitely a move in the right in the direction. For example, Singapore, we are seeing that the carbon tax is already in place, and all the industries are a part of that. So refiners are now paying tax, although starting with the low levels, but by 2030 we expect this to reach by $50 per ton, which could be actually quite a big impact on the net cash margin for the refiners, and hence they could start justifying some of the projects which are being held up with no or low carbon prices. Sunil, from your perspective, I know you talk about solutions and overall, for the producers, how do you bring carbon price into the overall cost benefit analysis of your projects?
Absolutely. I think this is again a good question from a solution perspective. So I'll give an example. How do we work, especially in Europe market? Because as you all know, there is a carbon tax, right? Which is something is very important for most energy companies there, right? So our solutions basically help to sort of look at what are the carbon emissions, right? I think we earlier talked about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, right? And then what we do is we actually link the process to the different carbon taxes and the credits, right? So we enable our solutions to include the carbon emission taxes embedded with your solutions, and help companies to look at what would be the impact of a different process configurations, different feedstock, different technologies, different solutions with respect to carbon tax and credits, right? This is something we are very actively, aggressively doing in Europe market for the moment. I think we are in discussion with few companies in Singapore because there's a tax coming up, tax applicable there in Singapore in Asia region, right? But I think from India perspective, it may take some time. But then this is something our technology can help it, right? Of course, the cost is very important factor, but then with regards to credit and the tax for related to carbon, our solutions can help to look at the different ways to minimize the carbon tax and carbon credit, right? So those are, I mean, obviously I won't name the energy companies, but we are working with large energy companies again, just to reiterate Europe, because there's a lot of focus going on there from the energy companies on the carbon tax, and they are investing on solutions because I think at the goal is to basically to reduce the carbon emissions, right? Because there's a tax applicable for that.
Yeah, I think rightly said. Suhas, from your perspective, I don't know whether you want to speak to what India is doing in terms of the carbon markets and how that will incentivize some of the moves towards low carbon technologies.
Yeah, that's what we just discussed, that carbon markets once developed will help in further investments in low carbon technologies, and it would be a big step going ahead.
Yeah. I think, I know India has started off with implementing a voluntary carbon markets, which are actually able to justify many of the projects in India on the voluntary carbon markets, which are currently being used and offset for many projects outside India, right? So I think we need to see the carbon prices in the range of $50 to $100 per ton, this decade, or even higher in the longer term, to change the investment behavior of the operators, right? And as I said, to make them incentivize for them to move on some of these projects, we would need a much higher carbon prices, and also incentivize investment in the low carbon technologies such as green hydrogen. CCS will require a much higher carbon prices than when we see today in many of the economies in Asia. Right, I think as we know, right, this is a topic and such an interesting topic that we can continue the discussion for much longer throughout the day. But I'm afraid, that's all the time we have for the discussion. But now I think we will look at some of the questions which have been, coming as we were discussing before we wrap up the session. So let me see, what questions have been coming up. Okay, I think there was one question around how come the green fuel or IU hydrogen is not easy solution to replace the conventional fuel. I think we discussed this around the barriers for green hydrogen.
I think yeah, if I may elaborate.
Yeah, sure.
I think this is a good question, right? I think the key barriers and challenges, as I said, right? It's about the cost, safety, transportation, right? I think it still needs to evolve, right? I mean, companies are investing a lot of focus there. Governments are supporting there. But in really, if you have to replace the conventional fuel, I think these aspects are important, right? Because it has to be affordable, right? And the cost is key thing there. When it comes to cryogenic hydrogen, the safety, transportation, and what will be the form of that? Is it like a methanol or the green ammonia and so on, right? And of course, the end use I talked about, fuel cells, right? So the readiness of all this is really become a challenge. I mean, these are the key barriers in today's kind of situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a question which is coming in. what would now see, I mean, you can share your thoughts on this. I think we have discussed a lot on this, but the question is, what would prompt refiners and chemical producers and owners to move aggressively to abate carbon dioxide emissions in a tight, margin play environment, right? And the big challenges remain that most of the processing technologies, such as reformers, crackers, FCCs, still produce large amount of carbon dioxide. While pushing hydrogen as a fuel source is an option, to achieve this in the near term is challenging. So are there any bold ideas to target an aspirational green refinery, in the future? So any one technology or one option you would actually pick in the very near term to move towards decarbonization? Who would like to take? Suhas, your thoughts?
Yeah, renewable energy, the solar electricity, solar-based energy is the first thing that can be easily done and should be done, because as I said earlier also, it has a price parity with fossil energy.
Yeah.
So the challenge which remains is the storage of that electricity, because the solar energy is not available throughout 24 hours. So the challenge is to store and to use it for 24/7 basis. So that is a challenge. But otherwise, the first thing that can be done is because we are already using fossil energy, fossil electricity, change it to renewable electricity via grid.
Yeah, I think, and that's a good point, right? That probably will eventually happen as a grid supply, grid power also gets more supply from the renewable power. So the power emission intensity also will reduce over time. But yeah, I mean, shifting away from a grid supply to a more third party supply from based on renewals will also be helpful if it is more competitive now. Sunil, from your perspective, one option which you would pick to go in the near term?
Yeah, I think biofeedstocks, right? So I think Suhas talked about solar and electrification. So I think biofeedstocks is also an important, right? Again, looking at barriers and other things is one aspect, but I think probably that might again help, right? So I would speak biofeedstock.
Sure. I think there's a question which talks about what do you think about the possibility of exporting SAF HVO from Asia Pacific to Europe, because there are a lot of regulation problems coming from Europe, highlighting the use of CPO from environmentally destructive farming. I mean, I can give some thoughts on this. Now, obviously, yes, there are regulations in Europe which are actually moving away from palm oil based or vegetable oil based feedstock, and they are preferring more waste based feedstock in the overall mix. So I think, and that's a shift which exporters from Asia will have to make, because the demand centers are shifting their demand towards more renewable feedstock. And I think there's nothing much you can do about it. You can probably start using that palm oil based feedstock for your own refineries, for your own feedstock in the refineries, and produce more bio-based refinery. I know Indonesia, they are increased. They have a target to reach 50% biofuel blending targets in the near term. So most of that diversion will happen from Europe towards Asia's own bio feedstock. So Asia is still lagging behind the overall bio fuel mandates which they have. So I think we'll see the diversion in that aspect. Moving on. I think probably we have time for one or two last questions.
Yeah, so there's a question to us, if I may address, about
Sure.
India develop any pilot machine, right? So there's a question about did India has developed any pilot machine for the emission monitoring and so on. So let me address this from a solution perspective. There's no pilot machine, but there are solutions and technologies available to monitor and control the emission level, right? And again, why I picked up, because I have a live case, an example from India, from an energy company, which I would name because they have publicly published this. It's a BPCL Kochi refinery, Bharat Petroleum. So they have deployed our Aspen technology solutions to sort of look at a complete plant-wide emissions, right? It's like a monitoring, and the technology, the modeling solutions help them to even reduce the emission levels, right? And they sort of put the complete rigorous model, and then the model will pick the data from the plant, look at the different emission levels, show it up a dashboard, so it shows up a current emissions, and then the model will predict what would the different levels of emissions can be reduced by looking at the different fuel options, how optimizing the energy, different source of energy. So all that is built in and available. So it's not a machine, but it's a solution available. Yeah.
I agree. I think that's obviously, there are tools and models
Yeah.
available to measure the site emissions.
Yeah.
And I think the saying is, right, you can only control what you can measure. So I think many refiners and chemical producers should actually start venture into measuring their current carbon emission, trying to understand where it is coming from, so that at least you can develop a solution which actually fits their purpose.
Yeah.
I think the question, India has totally depended on coal for the power plants and for the fuel sources. How do you think suddenly India can move from coal to other green fuels? I know that Suhas, you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. This sudden movement is not possible. The question is correct. So India is historically based on coal because we have coal as in a lot of quantity. So, but India is a growing country, and the energy requirement is growing, and it is projected to grow for next several years. So what we are doing is whatever the new power production is being done. So that would be on the renewable sources rather than coal. So in that direction we are moving, and slowly as the coal-based power plants get old and they need to be replaced, then they would be replaced by the renewable sources. So this sudden change won't happen, but gradual change is definitely there.
Correct.
I agree. I think this also links back to the point of affordability, right? I mean, there's we're talking about the different dimension of sustainability, which is affordability, and I'm sure I think you all would agree that the risk of there is a risk of an over dependence upon supply from new technologies, and whether that supply is available at the right time at the right price, to meet the demand. And I think governments in large economies such as India, or they will have to balance investments in both traditional and new energies, which are required during this transition towards new fuels. Rapid shift or rapid dependence upon these fuels could make prices unaffordable, as we've seen in the past 2 years. Okay, so I think with this, I think that's all the time we have for the session today. And I think in terms of wrapping up the session, I would say yes, there are a number of challenges, but equally there are also a number of options to develop a sustainable operation for our own refining and chemical producers. And no doubt, many of these options are at nascent stages at the moment. They are being thought about, they're being looked at from different angles. And we hope that the improvement in technology, innovation, and operational excellence will lead to a faster adoption of these solutions. Although it is a really unsettling time for many refiners and chemical producers, but and so the saying is, right, the time to worry is now rather than later. So for all this transition will open a number of opportunities for many of us in the industry. Thank you, Suhas and Sunil, for your thoughts during the session. And with this, I will hand it over to you, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Sushant. And just like you said, unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today's session. So we've come to the end of the first session at ADS Digital today. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to our speakers and moderator for your time and for the very informative Q&A. I think everybody had a lot of very good questions to ask. And we've really gotten a chance to explore some of the insight that you've shared today. So it's been a genuine pleasure getting to know exactly maybe what we can do with regard to the energy transition pertaining to the refining and petrochemicals industry. So thank you again, everyone, for your time and for sending in your questions. If you have any other questions that perhaps we could not answer today, do write in to us directly and we'll be sure to connect you with the relevant speaker. So now we'll be taking a short break for lunch, and in an hour's time at 1 p.m. Singapore time, we'll resume for the second part of ADS Digital, which will look to address the energy transition as well as green and biotechnology. Have a good lunch break, and we'll see you in an hour.